There is a fear every woman carries quietly, a fear she rarely speaks aloud, a fear she buries beneath strength, independence, and confidence. It is the fear of giving her heart to someone who does not know how to protect it, the fear of loving a man who turns out to be weak, uncertain, or incapable of leading himself, let alone a relationship. She fears losing herself in someone who cannot match her depth. She fears trusting the wrong man. And in Machiavellian psychology, this fear is not irrational. It is strategic, ancient, and deeply rooted in survival. Women do not fear being alone as much as they fear choosing wrong. For centuries, a woman's survival depended on the strength and certainty of the man she aligned with. Even today, when she chooses a partner, her subconscious looks not at his words, but his power, his discipline, his emotional control, his direction. She fears the man who looks strong but collapses on the inside. She fears the one who promises everything yet cannot lead himself through adversity. She fears the man who needs her more than he stands for himself. A woman's deepest fear is giving her loyalty to a man who doesn't deserve it. She fears building with someone who has no vision. She fears supporting someone who would not support himself. This is why her tests are relentless. This is why she observes silently. This is why she pulls back when she senses weakness. She is not trying to hurt you. She is trying to protect herself from misjudgment. She is trying to avoid the ancient mistake of choosing a partner who drains rather than strengthens. When a woman senses masculine uncertainty, she withdraws. When she senses desperation, she loses attraction. When she sees a man who cannot control his emotions, she stops trusting him. This is not cruelty. This is biological intelligence. Machiavelli taught that people follow strength, not weakness. Women are no different. They follow power, consistency, confidence. They do not fear a man's darkness. They fear a man's instability. Darkness in a man can be controlled. Instability cannot. In her silence, she evaluates how to handle pressure. She watches how you react to disrespect. She analyzes how you pursue your goals, how you speak to people, how you navigate conflict. She does not fear challenge. She fears chaos. She does not fear a man with edges. She fears a man with no backbone. Her fear is not irrational. It is refined. It is her built-in lie detector. When she pulls back, it is rarely because you failed. It is because you revealed something she cannot risk her future on. A woman fears loving a man who tries to impress her instead of impressing himself. She fears the man who sacrifices his principles just to keep her close. She knows that if a man cannot stand firm with her, he cannot stand firm in the world. She knows that if he is emotionally volatile, he will crumble when life tests him. She knows that if he is not disciplined, he will lose himself and then blame her for it. Her fear is choosing someone who becomes a burden rather than an asset. But here is the truth Machiavelli would whisper only to those wise enough to understand. A woman does not fear a powerful man. She fears a powerless one. She fears the man who hides behind charm. She fears the one who is secretly insecure. She fears the man who cannot master himself yet demands loyalty from her. Power is not dominance. It is direction. It is purpose. It is certainty. And when a man carries these traits, her fear dissolves. She relaxes. She trusts. She follows naturally, without force. A woman's fear becomes amplified when she perceives emotional unpredictability. If you cannot regulate your emotions, she cannot rely on you. If you cannot lead yourself, she cannot feel safe with you. She needs stability, not perfection. She needs conviction, not smooth words. A man without emotional control becomes dangerous in the worst way, not because he is powerful, but because he is unpredictable. When Machiavelli wrote about power, he emphasized the necessity of self-mastery. A man must become the ruler of himself before he can influence the world around him. The same principle applies to relationships. When a man is grounded, disciplined, and sovereign, a woman feels secure. Her fear transforms into admiration. Her hesitation becomes devotion. Her doubt becomes loyalty. This secret fear shapes how she chooses, how she tests, how she loves. It is not a weakness. It is her ancient guardrail. When a man understands this, he stops seeing her fears as obstacles and starts seeing them as guidance. Her fear teaches him what kind of man he must become: stable, purposeful, self-reliant, emotionally controlled. A man whose power does not come from controlling her, but from controlling himself. And once a man embodies this, something remarkable happens. The fear she hides dissolves. Her softness returns. Her loyalty sharpens. Her love deepens. Because a woman is not afraid of giving her heart. She is afraid of giving it to someone who cannot hold it with strength. When a man becomes immovable in his purpose, disciplined in his actions, and calm in his storms, she sees what she has been searching for: safety without dependence, strength without arrogance, leadership without force. Her greatest fear vanishes the moment she realizes she has found a man who can walk beside her, not behind her, not beneath her, not above her, but a man who stands firm in himself. And when she finds that, she gives everything, without hesitation, without fear, because the only thing a woman fears more than choosing the wrong man is losing the right one. But there is another layer to this fear, one even fewer people understand. A woman fears becoming the only source of strength in a relationship. She fears having to carry both her emotional world and his. She fears becoming the masculine energy because he refuses to step into it. When she senses that she is the one holding the relationship together, her attraction slowly dies, not because she wants control, but because she is exhausted by it. Machiavelli knew that when one must take on roles that are not their nature, corruption enters, not moral corruption, but structural imbalance, and imbalance destroys desire. A woman fears losing the parts of herself that only flourish when she feels safe. Her femininity, her softness, her receptivity, these sides only awaken in the presence of a man grounded enough to allow them. When she is with a man who is chaotic, unpredictable, or needy, she cannot open. She must remain vigilant, alert, guarded, and she hates this. She resents the version of herself that he forces her to become. She suffers quietly because every instinct inside her tells her she is carrying more weight than she should. There is a fear she hides that is even darker, the fear of becoming invisible. She fears giving love that is taken for granted. She fears devotion that is not reciprocated. She fears becoming the background of a man's life while she places him at the center of hers. This fear makes her test his consistency. She watches how present he is, how deeply he listens, how much effort he carries without being reminded. If she feels she is competing for his attention with his own laziness or indifference, she retreats, because to her, emotional neglect is more painful than conflict. A woman also fears the man who tries to change her essence instead of elevating it. She fears the man who loves the idea of her, but not the reality. She fears being molded, controlled, or diminished. And this fear becomes stronger when she senses insecurity disguised as dominance. Machiavelli warned that weak men often use force to compensate for lack of power. Women detect this instantly. She fears the man who demands respect instead of earning it. She fears the man who uses jealousy, anger, or manipulation to mask his inadequacy. True power never needs to prove itself, and she knows it. Her fear intensifies when she realizes a man cannot handle her truth. Women do not fear emotional depth. They fear emotional fragility. She fears that her honesty will break him, that her desires will intimidate him, that her ambition will threaten him, that her independence will make him crumble. This is why she admires the man who stands unchanged in the face of her intensity, the man who listens without defensiveness, the man who remains calm even when she is not, the man whose self-worth does not fluctuate with her moods. This is strength she can trust. She also fears the man who misuses her vulnerability. Every woman carries a story, a wound, a betrayal, a disappointment. When she begins to trust, she exposes these hidden parts of herself. If he turns these confessions into weapons during conflict, she will never trust him again. Her fear is not vulnerability. Her fear is betrayal of vulnerability. Machiavelli wrote that betrayal destroys trust faster than aggression. It is the deepest form of weakness, because it reveals a man who cannot be relied upon. A woman's heart shuts permanently when she sees this. The fear no one talks about is the fear of emotional abandonment, not physical, emotional. She fears being with a man who is present in body, but absent in spirit. A man who is distracted, disconnected, numb. She fears waking up one day and realizing she has spent years with someone who was never truly there. This fear is why she needs emotional presence, not constant affection, but conscious awareness. A man who hears her silence. A man who feels her energy shift. A man who sees her even when she is not speaking. That is the man she trusts. But here is the Machiavellian paradox. A woman does not fear masculine power. She craves it. What she fears is masculine collapse. She fears the moment he breaks down and she is forced to take the lead. She fears that burden. She fears losing her softness, losing her emotional freedom, losing the ability to lean into her nature When a man cannot lead himself, she must lead both, and this slowly kills her attraction. Yet when a man holds his frame, when he remains stoic, calm, strategic, disciplined, her fear transforms into admiration. She sees him as an anchor in a chaotic world. She feels protected without him needing to shield her. She feels guided without him needing to command her. She feels valued without him needing to convince her. His power is silent, not loud, steady, not aggressive, directional, not domineering. This is the masculine presence that dissolves every fear she carries. And when that fear dissolves, something extraordinary occurs. She stops testing. She stops doubting. She stops guarding. Her trust becomes powerful. Her love becomes intense. She gives without hesitation. She supports with passion. She follows his lead willingly because she knows he will not misguide her. And in that moment, the masculine and feminine reach the balance that Machiavelli hinted at in all great power dynamics. One leads with strength, the other empowers with loyalty. A woman's deepest fear is not losing a man, it is choosing the wrong one. But when she finds the right one, a man rooted in self-mastery, her fear becomes her devotion. Her loyalty becomes unshakable, and her love becomes the most powerful force he will ever experience. There is another fear she carries, one that hides beneath her confidence, her achievements, her independence. She fears becoming the woman who gives everything, only to realize he never deserved any of it. She fears pouring her loyalty into a man who sees her love as a convenience, not a privilege. This fear makes her cautious, guarded, slow to give her full heart. She is not afraid of loving. She is afraid of loving blindly. And a woman with experience knows how dangerous blind love can be. She fears being emotionally responsible for a man who refuses to grow. She fears the man who stays stuck in his patterns, the one who refuses to evolve, the one who expects her to accept him as he is while he makes no effort to become better. This fear is not shallow. It is survival. She knows that a man who remains stagnant will eventually become jealous of her progress. He will resent her confidence, her ambition, her transformation. When she advances, and he does not, he will become threatened, as she fears the day he begins to sabotage the very growth that once attracted him. A woman fears the man who uses her to escape his failures, the man who sees her not as a partner, but as a hiding place for his insecurities. She fears being the emotional shelter for someone who never learned to stand on his own. She knows that the moment she becomes his escape, she loses respect for him, because a man who runs from life will eventually run from responsibility, accountability, and the relationship itself. This fear makes her value men who confront their battles instead of avoiding them. She also fears emotional inconsistency, a man who changes depending on his mood, his day, or his environment. She knows that instability in a man leads to instability in a relationship. Machiavelli wrote that unpredictability is useful in strategy, but destructive in loyalty. She fears the man who is one person when he is happy and another when he is frustrated. She watches how he reacts under pressure, not how he behaves when life is easy, because his true character appears in his worst moments, not his best. There is a deeper fear she rarely reveals, the fear of losing herself. Women give deeply. When they love, they invest emotionally, mentally, spiritually. She fears that she will pour so much into a man that her own dreams will disappear. Her ambitions will fade. Her happiness will shrink. She fears becoming the version of herself that only lives to keep someone else satisfied. This fear is why she remains vigilant about her boundaries. She guards her energy. She tests whether a man adds to her life or drains it. She fears losing her identity in someone who does not value it. Another hidden fear. She fears being misunderstood. She wants emotional connection, not control. She wants security, not domination. She wants stability, not perfection. Yet men often misunderstand her softness as weakness and her strength as threat. She fears being misread, misjudged, misinterpreted, and when a man truly understands her, not just listens to her words, but reads her silence, her fear melts instantly. Understanding is more powerful than love. It is rare, and to her, rare means valuable. There is a psychological truth Machiavelli would approve of. A woman's fear is her sharpest intuition. She senses danger before it appears. She detects weakness before it reveals itself. She feels dishonesty before a man speaks it. Her fear is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition. As she pays attention to patterns, men lie with words, but they tell the truth with consistency. She fears the moment she realizes his words meant nothing, because once trust breaks, her love never returns the same. She also fears emotional laziness, a man who stops trying, a man who gets comfortable, a man who slowly withdraws the effort that once made her feel desired. She knows that effort is not a phase. It is a mindset. When a man stops pursuing, she stops trusting, because to her, effort is not romance, it is respect. It says, "You matter," and when effort disappears, she feels chosen by habit, not by intention. This fear makes her pull back long before she leaves. But perhaps the darkest fear of all is the fear of sacrificing her peace for a man who cannot protect it. Peace is everything to a woman. It is her most sacred possession. When she shares space with a man whose energy is chaotic, unpredictable, aggressive, or careless, her nervous system goes into survival mode. She fears becoming addicted to dysfunction. She fears normalizing anxiety. She fears confusing intensity with connection. She fears that chaos will become her home, because once it does, she will forget what real love feels like. Yet Machiavelli would say this fear is also her greatest strength. It forces her to choose wisely. It forces her to observe deeply. It forces her to test the character of a man before giving him her loyalty. And when she finally chooses, she chooses with conviction. She chooses a man who is mentally strong, emotionally regulated, deeply grounded in himself. A man she can follow without losing her identity. A man she can love without losing her power. A man who becomes the antidote to every fear she once carried. And once she finds that, she stops fearing. She begins to build. She begins to trust. She begins to open. She becomes the version of herself that only appears beside a man who knows how to lead, how to love, and how to protect without controlling. Her fear transforms into her greatest devotion. Her guarded heart becomes her most powerful gift, and she gives it completely, but only to the man who proves he can. She fears one more thing, something she rarely admits even to herself. She fears loving a man who is emotionally unavailable, but physically present. This fear is subtle, invisible, and slow burning. She fears being with someone who is near her, but never truly with her, a man who offers his time, but not his attention, his presence, but not his soul. She fears being loved in a shallow way, where she becomes an option in a life she treats as a priority. This fear eats at her from the inside because she does not want half love. She wants depth, presence, alignment. A woman fears investing in a man who lacks emotional courage. Men talk about physical bravery, but a woman watches for emotional bravery, the courage to be honest, vulnerable, accountable. She fears the man who hides behind silence instead of speaking truth. She fears the man who shuts down during conflict instead of solving it. Emotional cowardice is more threatening to her than aggression because it means she will always face problems alone. And once she feels alone in a relationship, she begins to detach. Another fear she hides is the fear of being judged for her emotional world. She fears being called too much when she feels deeply or too little when she protects her heart. A woman's emotional landscape is intense, complex, layered, but she fears the man who sees this depth as a burden instead of a gift. When she opens herself emotionally, she is offering him a map of her inner world. If he dismisses her feelings, minimizes her emotions, or mocks her vulnerability, her fear becomes a wall. He will never break through again. She also fears the man who wants her body, but not her mind. A woman knows the difference instantly. When a man is drawn to her physically, but indifferent to her thoughts, she feels replaceable. And being replaceable is a fear that cuts deeper than heartbreak. She wants a man who is captivated not just by her presence, but by her intelligence, her ideas, her complexity. She fears the man who loves her surface and ignores her substance. Because surface attraction fades, but connection survives everything. There is a darker fear she rarely speaks, the fear of being emotionally overshadowed. She fears loving a man who is constantly overwhelmed by his own problems, his own trauma, his own insecurities. She fears becoming secondary to his unresolved past. She has no issue helping a man heal, but she fears becoming the nurse to a man who refuses to treat his wounds. Machiavelli would call this the mistake of investing in a leader who cannot even lead himself. She knows that if she becomes responsible for fixing him, she will lose the version of herself she fought to become. A woman also fears inconsistency disguised as passion. The man who is intense today and indifferent tomorrow. The man who loves with fire in the beginning, but becomes cold with time. She fears falling for a man whose affection is unpredictable, whose interest is unstable, whose love is seasonal. This fear makes her value the calm, steady man, the one who is stable in desire, consistent in action, dependable in intention. She fears the flame that burns too hot to fast, because it always burns out first. Her fear deepens when she senses a man lacks direction. Purpose is a man's backbone. Vision is his compass. Without them, he becomes lost, and she fears being dragged into his confusion. A man without purpose has no emotional structure. He sways, he drifts, he collapses. She fears tying her future to someone who has no map for his own. She knows that without direction, love becomes chaos, and chaos becomes pain. She would rather walk alone with clarity than walk beside a man lost in his own mind. Another fear she carries silently is the fear of emotional dependency. Not hers, his. She fears a man who relies on her for validation, identity, or happiness. She fears being the anchor for a man who refuses to anchor himself. This fear is heavy because emotional dependency feels flattering at first, but suffocating over time. She fears being the center of someone else's world when she is still trying to build her own. She wants partnership, not possession, connection, not dependence, but the deepest fear, the one she never says aloud, is this. She fears giving her love to someone who cannot hold its magnitude. Her love is not small. It is not passive. It is not ordinary. It is fire, loyalty, intensity, softness, devotion. She fears the man who mistakes her power for pressure. She fears the man who feels overwhelmed by the depth she offers. Because once a man makes her feel like she is too much, she begins to shrink, not for him, but away from him. Yet when she meets a man who can receive her fully, her intensity, her depth, her softness, her fire, her fear dissolves when she sees that he remains grounded through her storms, unshaken by her emotions, stable in his presence, clear in his mind, steady in his intentions. Everything she once feared becomes everything she wants to build with him. Her heart unlocks, her loyalty sharpens, her devotion becomes dangerous in the most beautiful way. Because when a woman stops fearing, she does not just love, she transforms the life of the man who earns her trust. She fears another kind of pain, the pain of unreciprocated effort. She fears being the only one fighting for the relationship while he becomes comfortable, passive, indifferent. She fears becoming the emotional engine that pulls a man who is no longer walking beside her. When a woman senses she is the only one carrying the weight, something inside her begins to detach, not because she wants to leave, but because she refuses to lose herself in a one-sided story. She fears the moment she realizes she has become the only source of effort, and he has become the only source of disappointment. She also fears the man who romanticizes her but does not study her. A woman wants to be seen, not fantasized, loved for who she is, not who he imagines her to be. She fears the man who falls in love with an illusion he created, because she knows he will leave once he meets the reality he wasn't prepared for. Machiavelli understood that the greatest deception is not lying to others, but lying to oneself, and she fears the man who lies to himself about her, because it means he can never love her authentically. She fears silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that grows between the people who stop trying to understand each other. She fears the distance that forms when conversations become shallow and connection becomes transactional. Emotional distance kills a woman long before physical absence. She senses it before he even realizes it's happening. She feels it in the tone of his voice, the delay in his responses, the shift in his energy. She fears the slow death of intimacy, the fading of curiosity, the loss of emotional presence. Another fear she carries is the fear of being compared to past lovers, to fantasies, to other women, to unrealistic standards. Comparison is the most subtle form of betrayal. It tells her she is not enough in the eyes of the man she chose. She fears being measured instead of appreciated. A woman wants to be chosen uniquely, not selected conditionally. When a man makes her feel replaceable, she becomes unreachable. There is a darker fear she almost never speaks aloud. She fears outgrowing him. She fears leveling up mentally, emotionally, spiritually, while he remains stagnant. She fears waking up one day more mature, more self-aware, more disciplined, more ambitious than the man she shares her life with. She fears that her growth will expose his lack of it. Machiavelli would say that when the forces grow at different speeds, the weaker one becomes resentful. She senses this long before it happens. She fears that her evolution will intimidate him instead of inspiring him. She fears being unloved in the way she loves. She loves with depth, intention, detail. She notices everything, the small words, the small gestures, the small changes. When she loves, she invests fully, almost spiritually. Her fear is that her intensity will be met with laziness, her loyalty with inconsistency, her devotion with half-effort. She fears being the only one who feels deeply, because when a woman feels alone in love, the relationship has already ended, even if she stays. Another fear she carries is the fear of emotional punishment. She fears that opening up will lead to manipulation, that showing weakness will lead to exploitation, that revealing her insecurities will give him weapons he should never have. She has learned from experience that not every man can handle the fragile parts of her. Some men break what they cannot understand. Some men attack what they cannot control. She fears the man who turns her honesty into ammunition, because from that moment, she will never trust him again. But perhaps the fear that cuts deepest is the fear of being with a man whose words promise the world, but whose actions build nothing. A woman is not moved by poetry if the poet never shows up in reality. She fears the charming man who has no character behind his charm, the man who talks about love but does not practice loyalty, the man who talks about a future but cannot manage his present. She fears the man whose promises are cheap because his discipline is weak. Machiavelli warned that those who rely on promises instead of actions are the most dangerous, not because they are evil, but because they are unreliable. Yet when she finds a man who aligns his words with his actions, her fear dissolves. When he does not just speak love, but demonstrates it. When he does not just claim loyalty, but proves it. When he does not just desire her, but chooses her, something inside her opens without hesitation. She feels safe, she feels understood, she feels valued. And a woman who feels valued becomes the most powerful ally a man could ever have. Her love becomes a force, her loyalty becomes unshakable, her presence becomes transformative. A woman's fears are not signs of weakness, they are signs of depth, signs of intelligence, signs of intuition sharpened by experience. And the man who understands her fears becomes the man she trusts with her heart. Because the moment she realizes he can hold her emotions, understand her silence, respect her boundaries, and match her loyalty, she stops fearing. And when she stops fearing, she begins to love in a way that can change a man's entire world. She fears another cruelty, the cruelty of emotional forgetfulness. She fears the man who forgets the little things she shared, the stories she trusted him with, the dreams she whispered late at night. When a man forgets what matters to her, she feels invisible. Not unloved, invisible, and invisibility is a woman's quiet heartbreak. She fears that her emotions, her thoughts, her existence will fade into the background of his life. She fears loving someone who remembers her only when it's convenient. She fears being tolerated, not treasured. There is a difference between keeping someone and choosing someone. A woman fears becoming part of his routine rather than part of his purpose. She fears being kept around out of habit, comfort, or fear of loneliness. She wants to be wanted, not just kept. When a man becomes emotionally passive, she becomes spiritually distant. And once she begins to detach, it is almost impossible to bring her back. She also fears the man who loves her potential, but not her reality. The man who is fascinated by who she could be, but uninterested in who she is. She fears being treated like a project instead of a partner. She fears being shaped into an ideal instead of being accepted as a complex human being. When a man tries to mold her, she feels enslaved. But when a man encourages her to grow, she feels inspired. She fears the former more than heartbreak itself. Another fear she hides is the fear of emotional repetition. She fears repeating the same pain she once escaped. She fears falling for the same patterns, the same behaviors, the same type of man she once healed from. This fear makes her cautious, analytical, sometimes distant. She isn't overreacting. She is recognizing patterns. A woman remembers emotional pain with impressive clarity. She never forgets how someone made her feel. And she fears making the same mistake twice because the second time, it becomes her fault, not fate. She fears the man who cannot apologize. A man who treats accountability as an attack will never build emotional intimacy. She fears the kind of masculinity that confuses ego with strength. She knows that a man who refuses to take responsibility is dangerous, not physically, but emotionally. He will blame her for his failures, accuse her for his insecurities, punish her for his weaknesses. She fears the man who cannot say, "I was wrong," because he will never say, "I need to grow." She also fears the emotional weight of being misunderstood. She fears that her intentions will be twisted, her emotions misread. her silence mistaken for indifference. She fears the man who reacts instead of listens. A woman wants to be seen through, not seen past. When a man misinterprets her depth as drama, her intuition as insecurity, her passion as aggression, she withdraws into a version of herself that feels safer, but less alive. She fears losing her emotional voice in a relationship where she cannot express herself freely. There is a darker fear, the fear of loyalty wasted. A woman's loyalty is not casual. It is not conditional. It is a full investment of her soul. She fears giving that loyalty to a man who does not protect it, honor it, or reciprocate it. She fears being loyal to a man who is faithful in body, but unfaithful in intention, the man whose eyes wander, whose attention drifts, whose discipline collapses when temptation arrives. Betrayal is not an act, but a mindset. She fears the kind of man who is loyal only until loyalty becomes inconvenient. She also fears emotional imbalance, giving more love than she receives, giving more effort than she gets, giving more patience than he offers. She fears the silent resentment that forms when she realizes she is loving in abundance and receiving in scarcity. Love should feel like nourishment, not depletion. She fears the moment she realizes she is pouring into someone whose cup has holes, because once she feels drained, her heart begins to protect itself, even from the man she loves. But the deepest, most silent fear, the one that shapes everything, is the fear that she is not lovable in the way she desires to be loved. Even the strongest woman has a soft, hidden space where she wonders if there exists a man capable of meeting her depth, her sensitivity, her fire, her softness. She fears that no man will understand the complexity she carries, that no man will match the loyalty she gives, that no man will see the world through the emotional lens she holds. Yet when she meets the man who feels her without explanation, who understands her without instruction, who respects her without condition, who values her without effort, her fears collapse, her walls drop, her softness returns, her trust becomes unbreakable, her love becomes fierce and unstoppable, because a woman does not fear love. She fears loving the wrong man, and when she finds the right one, she becomes the most powerful force in his life, not because she needs him, but because she trusts him enough to give him everything she is. Here is more, continuing the same tone, depth, and Machiavellian psychological intensity still without headings or numbering. The deeper truth is that this fear does not appear suddenly. It is shaped slowly, through moments she never talks about. The time she opened up and someone used her vulnerability as a weapon. The time she loved someone who only loved the power they had over her. The time she tried to trust her instincts, but everyone told her she was overthinking. These small cuts don't vanish. They accumulate until she learns the Machiavellian rule of self-protection. Never hand anyone a sword that can destroy you. So she keeps parts of herself locked away, even from people who genuinely care, because she learned early that trust without caution is self-destructs. And yet, this fear can push her towards silence, not because she is weak, but because she is strategic. She watches before she speaks. She evaluates before she invests. She studies what people do, not what they say. She pays attention to tone, consistency, patterns, motives. She becomes sharper, more aware, more emotionally intelligent because fear, when mastered, becomes perception. And perception is one of the most powerful forms of protection a person can possess. But when this fear controls her, it becomes her prison. She becomes too cautious to enjoy closeness, too guarded to feel connection, too self-protective to allow anyone inside her world. She starts seeing threats where there are none, reading danger in a harmlessness, and assuming every new beginning is a disguised ending. This is what makes the fear dangerous. It convinces her that isolation is safer than intimacy, and she doesn't realize that this emotional distance not only keeps people out, it keeps her trapped inside herself. Yet the transformation begins the moment she understands this. The world cannot exploit a woman who knows her own worth, sees her own intentions clearly, and recognizes her emotional power. Once she learns that boundaries are not walls but filters, she stops hiding, she stops shrinking, she stops apologizing for her strength. She stops believing that vulnerability is weakness, and she starts using it as a tool to choose who truly deserves access to her. She starts reading people without absorbing them. She starts observing without fearing. She starts listening without internalizing every judgment. She becomes calm in situations that once terrified her, because she finally grasps the Machiavellian truth. Fear is not something to escape, but something to command. The moment she stops running from it, she begins to channel it, and that is when she becomes a Woman no one can manipulate. Continue. Here is more. Continuing in the same intense Machiavellian, psychological, emotional tone, no headings, no numbering, she begins to realize that the fear she carried for years was never truly about others. It was about the parts of herself she didn't fully trust yet. The fear of being misunderstood came from her own uncertainty. The fear of being abandoned came from not knowing whether she was enough. The fear of being replaced came from old wounds she never healed. But when she finally confronts these shadows within herself, she understands the most liberating truth of all. No one can take from her what she no longer doubts she possesses. This is when a shift happens deep inside her. She stops waiting for reassurance from the outside world and starts giving it to herself. She stops seeking validation from people who don't even understand their own emotions. She stops trying to earn loyalty from those who only offer convenience. She becomes the source of her own stability, her own confidence, her own emotional clarity. And when a woman becomes self-sufficient in this way, she becomes impossible to manipulate because people can only control you through the things you depend on. The fear that once made her shrink now becomes the fire that makes her expand. She becomes more selective, not because she is cold, but because she finally respects her own energy. She chooses connections that feel mutual, balanced, and steady. She removes herself from conversations that drain her. She withdraws from dynamics that don't grow her. She stops giving chances to people who show her the same patterns repeatedly. She no longer sees letting go as a loss. She sees staying in the wrong place as self-betrayal. And slowly, the world begins to respond differently to her. People start respecting her boundaries because she enforces them without hesitation. They stop trying to test her because she no longer tolerates behavior that weakens her peace. They become more cautious with their words because she no longer reacts emotionally. She observes first, responds later. Even those who tried to manipulate her in the past become confused by her transformation because the old version of her, the one who feared losing people, no longer exists. She becomes the kind of woman who can walk away without looking back, the kind of woman who can say no